Hi, everybody. It is Easter weekend, and so the lesson this morning is, you can see April 12th here from 1 Corinthians 15, and here's my outline. So we'll just briefly review the word for gospel. Do y'all remember what that word is, Christy?
Euangelion.
The euangelion in Greek. Basar is the Hebrew word, and it's going to show up today in Isaiah 52. And then the second thing is in verse 2 out of 1 Corinthians. Oh, I've got that wrong. It should be 1 Corinthians 15. Second thing is we're going to think about standing fast for just a few minutes. And I want to, in case I forget to do so in just a minute, verse 2, spent a lot of time thinking about that. And so I want to thank Christy and my good friend Justin Langford, and also my good friend Jeff Geary for going round and round with me in conversation about verse 2. So that'll be the second thing we do. And so I'm hoping the first two things won't take but just a few minutes. And then the third thing is verses 3 and 4 say twice these things about Jesus and his death and his resurrection being, quote, according to the scriptures. So I just want to wonder about that for a bit. And so the first thing is I'm going to speculate what I think he's referring to by according to the scriptures. And then the second thing is we're going to pick some pieces out of the chapter, out of chapter 15. And, if you want to know what an author's thinking about, then my good mentors and friends have always told me you need to keep reading to see what they're thinking about. So he goes on later in the chapter to talk about lots of different Old Testament references. And so we're going to address maybe two of them at best over the next 45 minutes. And then after we have wondered about according to the scriptures for, about 30 minutes or so, probably a little longer than that, then we're going to listen to Michael W. Smith sing It Is Well With My Soul, because the song pretty much says it. So I'm hoping that the lesson from 1 Corinthians 15 will say it, and then we can listen to him say it in music. Okay, so we're supposed to meet Sunday morning at 9 o'clock as a class. I sent a link to a Google room for that. But if you are watching this video prior to Sunday, and you would like to join us for just a few minutes to say hello on Sunday morning at 9 o'clock, here is the link that I'll be using. It's a Zoom link. And the reason I'm using Zoom is because it allows me to tile everybody so everybody can see everybody and talk together this way, where the Google link doesn't do that. So here's the information that you need for that. Okay, off we go. So the first verse says, now I make known to you, brethren, the gospel which I preached to you, which also you received, in which you stand. So the Greek word for gospel here, you guessed it, the euangelion. But here's something interesting to note in the first verse. The word preached here is the Greek word euangelizo. And so literally, he says, now I make known to you, brethren, the gospel which I gospelized. That's Wadeborn interpretation. That's horrible. There's different ways to say preached in Greek, evidently, and I chased those down, and we could spend 15 minutes looking at that, but I'm not going to do that. Dr. Langford pointed out something to me about how Paul uses this word, the euangelizo, at the first 3 times in the book of 1 Corinthians. He uses it the first of the chapter, and then he uses a different word, keriso in Greek, to say preached later in the chapter, which he does in this chapter actually, to talk about the specific content of the gospel. And so it's a way of saying good news and then tell you about the specifics. It's a cool language thing we're not going to chase down. The second verse says, by which also you are saved, if you hold fast the word which I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. Now, this idea, the gospel by which you are saved, if you hold fast the word I preached to you. So many other New Testament authors say similar things. And so I have a bunch of references here. There's, Matthew and Mark both have the story where it ends with Jesus saying, you will all be hated by all because of my name, but it is the one who has endured to the end. The idea of holding fast who will be saved. And then in Romans, Paul does this, if you continue in his kindness, otherwise you will be cut off. The author of Hebrews several times, for if we become partakers, if we have become partakers, if we hold fast. James says that we should persevere so that we cannot have the crown of life taken. The book of Revelation says something very similar about people taking your crown. And this can be a little unnerving, so you can see why I printed these off and sent them to my friends to talk about this. Dr. Langford pointed out one thing that was really helpful to me, which is in verse 2, he says, by which you are also saved if you hold fast the word which I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. And you can see later, the whole point here at the early point of the chapter from Paul appears to be the importance of the resurrection. And so he uses a similar kind of wording here in verse 14. He says, he's making the case. There evidently is some argument going on about whether these people think belief in the resurrection of Christ is necessary. And so Paul makes the point, it is absolutely necessary that you believe in the resurrection. And so it's, in a way, he's saying that your faith is in vain if the resurrection is not a key component of your belief system. So that was helpful to me because it's in the context of the chapter. But Dr. Langford in particular and Jeff sent me a couple of things. In order to not belabor the point here so that we can move on to the next verses, I typed this out because I wanted to say it carefully. So this is the next slide is a paraphrase of what Justin and Jeff and Christy have all helped me with. So I'm just going to read it to you because it's helpful for me in handling this idea about endurance and standing fast. So Paul is stating, like the other New Testament examples cited, that genuine faith endures and is proved by holding fast. I don't think these types of passages affect Jesus' statement in the Gospels, like where he says in John 10, my sheep hear my voice, and I know them, they follow me, and I give them eternal life. They will never perish. No one will snatch them out of my hand. My Father who has given them to me is greater than all, and no one is able to snatch them out of my Father's hand. I and the Father are one. So this security of knowing that I belong to him is in his hands. Last paragraph. It's akin to James's letter, who so bluntly says that faith without works is dead. True faith endures, but this doesn't prevent people like Paul and the others that you saw quoted on the other page from urging his audience with persuasive tactics to reflect on this. Also remember that the big issue that Paul addresses here in 1 Corinthians 15 is their seeming belief that there was no resurrection from the dead, not of Christ, but in general. So he goes on later in the chapter, this is going to come up. It's like the last slides today, talking about our bodily resurrection. This leads Paul to make the extensive argument that there is resurrection from the dead and that Jesus' resurrection proves this. They were falling into a dangerous way of thinking, and he is reminding them of the ramifications of this. I think that's what he's alluding to in verse 2 when he says they may have believed in vain. If they really do think there is no resurrection from the dead, then they never fully heard and accepted the gospel that Paul preached, because it clearly contained the word about Jesus' resurrection. And then Jeff sent me these two verses in an email to help think about it. Bart preached a sermon on this a couple of years ago that I found helpful as well, when he was doing the part in Hebrews about tasting the goodness of the Spirit and falling away. This is the parable of the sower, and it says in Luke 8, the seed in the good soil, these are the ones who have heard the word in an honest and good heart, and hold it fast, and bear fruit with perseverance. So, and you know the story of the soils, and so it's helpful for me to think about this idea of standing fast with that. And then in Hebrews 4, Jeff pointed out all through the end of chapter 3 and chapter 4, he's talking about this idea of belief and faith. And he says in verse 2 of chapter 4, indeed we have had good news, the euangelion, preached to us, just as they also. But the word they heard did not profit them, because it was not united in faith, or united by faith in those who heard. Okay, so those are all helpful things for me. If they're helpful for you, great. All right, we're 10 minutes in, and now to the real fun stuff. In verse 3, 1 Corinthians 15, he says, for I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received. This is what he received. So evidently this was during the years where he disappeared. He goes off. Talks about this in Galatians. He received this gospel from Christ. So he was an expert in the Bible, but it's like he had to relearn it after he met Jesus. That Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. So I would so much have liked if Paul at this point would have said, here's exactly what I mean by that according to the Scriptures. Now he does, then go through from verse 3 and 4 on forward in the chapter to talk about the importance of Christ's resurrection. He does that like through verse 19, the importance of the resurrection. But there's no real specific references there where he says, like it says in Hosea chapter 6 or whatever. So it's not there. But I'm going to show you what I think he may have been referring to. I'm just speculating, out of Isaiah and Zechariah on the next two pictures. Then we're going to spend more time. Verse 20 and 23, he refers to what are called the first fruits. So that's going to be fun. And I'm going to tackle this one because it's going to be useful next week, because next week we're in Luke chapter 4. And so once again, when we started this business back a couple weeks ago, we looked at Leviticus 23. Remember that? Leviticus 23. Mm-hmm. It's all the feasts, mm-hmm. and these were the moeds. Mm-hmm. So we're going to do that again, because the culmination of that story, Leviticus 23 through 25, 26, actually creates the framework for which Jesus speaks when he quotes Isaiah 61 in Luke 4. So that's what we're going to do next week, but I want to introduce it again. This idea of the first fruits, man. Oh, dude. It's so awesome. So we're going to spend some time there. So big red arrow. And then Adam comes up, abolishing all rule. The language out of Daniel chapter 2 comes up. Placing everything in subjection under his feet comes out of Psalm 8. Verses 38 to 41, he tells this story about resurrection with the planting the seed, and it dies and it grows, and there's all kinds of illusion. Men and beasts and birds and fish and heavenly bodies. These things are all tied to Genesis chapter 1. And then, I'm not going to do any of that, because this one, as he finishes the chapter, he mentions the trumpets. And the Feast of Trumpets is actually also part of that story. So the first month, the third month, and the seventh month, 3 trips. And the third trip includes the Feast of the Trumpets. And so Paul brings up the idea of the trumpets, and he puts it in the context of resurrection. And so that's the last thing. That's the last detail we're going to look at. And then I'm just going to read straight up where he quotes from Isaiah 25. I'm just going to read it straight up at the end, and then I'm going to shut up and let you listen to Michael W. Smith. All right, ready? So first thing is Isaiah and Zechariah. So here's the outline. Prophetic visions and poetry in sequence. So here's what I think. I think some of the prophetic books, at least in places in Isaiah, and I think with the visions of Zechariah, and you have to know, I'm not an expert, but you just make up your own mind. As I show you this, it appears that there is some sort of sequence here going on in these prophetic poems and in the prophetic visions of these books. I'm very confident that the visions in Zechariah and the poems in Isaiah are interconnected because the same words and images are used over and over and over again. So we'll just look at a couple verses. We could spend hours and hours doing this, but I think there's evidence that there's a sequence going on here that includes the Lord / the Messianic branch / David or the Davidic king coming. There's this glorious language. At the end of the days, the Davidic king comes, and he is the branch, the Messianic branch, and the servant of the Lord, and he makes all things right, and he's got the Spirit of God on him, and he's judging the nations, and the Lamb and the lion lie down together, and it's all this beautiful imagery of the coming king, who is God, who is David, who is the servant, who is the branch. And these are all tied up in the visions and the poems of Isaiah and Zechariah. Then, at some point in the sequence, this individual is all mixed up. I don't know if the right word is mixed. He's equated. He's indistinguishable from the Lord himself. And he is pierced for sin. So I'm going to show it to you, see what you think. And then, at the end of Isaiah and Zechariah, this image again of victory over death, a new Jerusalem, the curse being eliminated, is there again. And I'm wondering if this sequence, this desire for him to come, his being pierced for sin, and his victory over death is a sequence in these books that we're supposed to notice. See what you think. So here's a take on it from Isaiah, and I've highlighted words to stand out. So we could have started this way earlier in the book of Isaiah, but notice that I've kept it all right here in what Hebrew scholar geeks call the third book of Isaiah. Kept it all together. So in chapter 52, it says in verse 7, "How lovely on the mountains are the feet of him who brings..." In the Greek Septuagint, that is the word, the euangelion, yeah. So who bring the gospel. How lovely are the feet of them. Who announces peace and brings good news, there it is again, of happiness, announcing salvation, saying to Zion, "Your God reigns." The hope of the Lord coming and reigning. Just a few verses later, "Now behold," I don't know how that became how. "Now behold, my servant will prosper. He will be high and lifted up and greatly exalted." It's the mixing of God coming and the servant of the Lord coming. You're going, well, which is it? both. And then the first couple of verses of chapter 53 describe him as being a shoot or a root. If you remember from last week, Isaiah 11 calls him the shoot or the root, the branch, calls him the branch from Jesse, and a root that comes out of the ground. So these images are all overlaying, to me, all overlaying one another. And then right there in the same chapter, it says in verse 5, he was pierced through for our transgressions and crushed for our iniquities. Just take a moment and read Isaiah 53. It's impossible, I think, for an honest person to read Isaiah 53 and not hear the work of Christ on the cross. Then in verse 12, at the end of the poem there, this language changes. It says, I will allot him a portion with the great. So he's greatly exalted here, and now he's being allotted a portion with the great. Now, if he's pierced through and crushed for our iniquities, just a couple verses later, it says, he is removed from the land of the living. He's killed. He's pierced and killed for the transgressions of the people. And then it says that he will be allotted a portion. He will divide the booty, the spoils. It's kind of like the word for spoils of war. The images become, I mean, if you're reading the poem, you're going, wait a minute, I thought he was dead. How can he be great and sharing in the spoils of the war? It's his resurrection. He's got to be alive again. It's all tied in the poem there. And then at the very end of the book of Isaiah, we're returned to this language. Behold, I create a new heavens and a new earth. I create Jerusalem for rejoicing. The wolf and the lamb will graze together. The lion will eat straw like the ox. The dust will be the serpent's food. So do you see the three? The great God and King, the servant branch Messiah, David's coming. He will be pierced for their sins. He will be resurrected, and there will be a new creation. It seems to me there's a sequence here. Check it out in the book of Zechariah. In chapter 2, Zechariah says, sing for joy and be glad. Behold, I am coming, and I will dwell in your midst, says the Lord. This is God's proper name right here in Hebrew. All caps, the Lord. God is coming. In the next chapter, in the next vision, he says, behold, I am going to bring my servant, the branch. And so if you're following the visions and you're tying the visions together in your head, you're going, well, is God coming or is his servant coming? It's the same kind of thing. It's this mixing, the servant and branch of the Lord, and God himself is the hope of his coming, the great King, the Lord himself. Then in chapter 12, it says in verse 10, so that they will look on me, this is the Lord speaking, whom they have pierced, and they will mourn for him. And the pronouns get extremely interesting. So I just encourage you, just read Zechariah 12 around that, verses 9, 10, 11. You'll see how it's a mixture together here, and you're thinking, well, wait a minute. Is God the one being pierced? Or is the servant being pierced? Or is it him or me? Or it's the same thing? And it's God himself as a man being pierced for transgression. Verse 1 of chapter 13 says, a fountain will be opened then for David and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem. That's a reference to everybody else. For sin and impurity. The idea that this servant is pierced, and then the result is forgiveness of sin. The price for sin is paid. And then right at the end of the book of Zechariah, I just have a few quotes here. In that day, living waters will flow out of Jerusalem. The Lord will be king over all the earth. All the land will be changed into a plain. People will live in it, and there will no longer be a curse. So, whatever you think, I really believe that the prophets are telling us the story of the gospel in the poetry and visions that they present. And maybe, just maybe, this was in Paul's mind according to the scriptures. Death, price for sin, resurrection, tied up in these images of the prophets. Okay, so the last thing here is to chase down this this business about the first fruits. Okay, so again, I'm just looking through the chapter to try to figure out what is he thinking about. So we know he's thinking about resurrection. The next thing he appears to be thinking about is this idea that Christ is raised from the dead, and he's described then as the first fruits of those who are asleep. Now, I have on this slide all 9 times that this word is used in the New Testament. And it would be great fun just to go through each one of them to talk about the nuances of what this word means. But I think Romans 8, I've got here, let's ponder this one for just a moment, is really getting at the idea here. And y'all, the idea of the first fruits comes straight out of Leviticus 23. So I'm going to show you that. So he says in Romans chapter 8 has got all this stuff that we've been talking about already. Romans chapter 8 is creation is groaning for the revelation of the sons of God. We are awaiting eagerly, he says, the redemption of our bodies. The hope here is the hope that's echoed all through the New Testament for Christ's return, for him to be making all things right again. And look at the language here. Not only this, but we also ourselves, having the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting eagerly for our adoption as sons. So I think that's a good context for what comes out of this search for what you mean by first fruits. So, okay, so we're just going to chase this down for a little bit, if that's all right with you. Chris, you good with that? Okay, so let's chase this down. We'll go back to Leviticus 23 again. Like I said, this is going to be useful next week too. So next week we're going to do Luke chapter 4. And in Luke chapter 4, Jesus rolls the scroll of Isaiah out and he reads right straight out of the passage in Isaiah where he's promising the year of Jubilee, which is the culminating piece of Leviticus 23 to 25. So we'll just start here at the beginning. Remember our conversation about the rhythms of life? You know, Mary shows up and she shows up in town and she's got Jesus, and it's on the 8th day. He's to be circumcised on the 8th day, and she's making a sacrifice for the firstborn, according to Leviticus chapter 12. They happen to be there for that reason. It's a rhythm of life. Over and over again, Jesus shows up. This is going to come out here in just a second, but Jesus shows up in Jerusalem at the time of Passover. In the book of John, he shows up at least 3 times. He shows up at Passover. The 3rd time, he is killed at Passover. And I'm going to read you a verse out of the Leviticus 23 here in just a second thing, and you're going to go, oh my word. So I have no doubt in my mind that Jesus very intentionally did what he did. That he was killed at Passover as the Passover lamb. That's the first festival. And then he was raised on the morning after the Sabbath. That's what it says. And the wave offering is given on the morning after the Sabbath in Leviticus 23. I don't think any of that's accidental. But if we're familiar with the way Leviticus 23 presents this and how this rhythm of life occurred among Jewish people, it makes it so much, to me, it makes it so much richer. Question, do you have to know this kind of thing to be a Christian? And I would say, No. But does it make your faith go, oh my word, yes? I would say that's what it does for me. Okay, so Leviticus 23 starts this way. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, the Lord's appointed times, which you shall proclaim as holy convocations. My appointed times are these. And so he starts right through them. The first one, so first of all, do y'all remember the appointed times word? On the next slide. Moedi there in the first one, or moed is the root that I've got circled right here. And these are the appointed times, yes? Leviticus 23:2. And then all the 7 feasts, appointed times. And then I reminded you, this is language from the creation story. The word seasons in the creation story. Signs and seasons is this word. The word used for the place where God met them is this word, the moed. It's where the seasons of life, the rituals that are practiced, and the places where I meet with God are all tied together. It's beautiful language, the Hebrew Scriptures. Okay, so the first one is the Sabbath thing. So for 6 days, work is to be done. On the 7th, there's a Sabbath of complete rest. You don't do any work. It is a Sabbath to the Lord in all your dwellings. So this is one of the things that made the Jewish people really well known. You would know it's a Jew because, they were accused in different cultures. In the Roman culture, they were accused of being lazy. What do you mean you just don't work all day? So it was a way of identifying them. They stopped. The Hebrew word is Shabbat. They stopped. It was the Sabbath. It was not intended to be some kind of rule, where, okay, well, we do this, check, we're good, this, check. It wasn't intended to be that way. In fact, in Exodus chapter 20, Moses tells us exactly why the Sabbath was instituted. So here it is out of the 10 Commandments. He says, remember the Sabbath. Now, just think about that for a second. There are places where you can go and it's keep the Sabbath. But he doesn't say that here. He says, remember the Sabbath.
To think about what it's about.
Yeah.
It's more important to think about what it's about than the doing of it. It's the purpose of why it's there is what we should ponder, which makes you want to do it.
Yes. To keep it is to, stop and ponder. So the question is, what should I be pondering? And so in Exodus 20, he tells us straight up. Here's the reason, verse 11. Because, for in 6 days, he says, the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day. Why do we stop? What are we remembering? Creation. What does it do to a person to stop and think about creation?
It makes you understand the Creator better and think of Him.
Think of the Creator. Do you think it's possible that it's also intended to make us think about what has been lost and the hope for a new creation? I think it's all tied together there. Okay. So that's the first one. And then we start in with the 7 feasts, okay? So the next few verses talk about the 7 feasts. And I'm not going to go through all 7 of them for the interest of time. As it turns out, let me show you the picture. This is slide 15, Chris. 3 times during the year, I've got them in highlight 1, 2, 3 on the calendar here. 3 times during the year. So every 7 days, stop on the 7th day. 3 times during the year, they made journey. They made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So 3 times a year, man, that's expensive. I guess they planned all their vacations around going to Jerusalem, I guess. But 3 times a year, they were to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And you can see the first trip was here in the first month, Nisan. And look at where that is. That's where we are right now. See that? The March-April time frame right here. This day right here, Nisan 14, for us this year was April the 8th, the first day of Passover. And then the day after Passover, they celebrated 7 days of unleavened bread. And then there was a festival of first fruits on the 16th day. First fruits. Okay, so in just a minute, I'll show you what that word is. It's very cool. Leviticus 23, the first fruits. All right, and then you can see 7 weeks later, 50 days to the count, 7 sevens later, they came again. And this is sometimes called the Feast of the First Fruits as well. And this is the Feast of Weeks. This is what we call Pentecost, the second one. 50 days later. Interesting. The first fruits. Pentecost. Okay, timing. These timings of these things is very interesting to me. And then the last one you can see down here. The third trip is in here. It's what's considered now the Jewish New Year. It's called the Feast of the Ingathering. It's called the Feast of Trumpets. Today they call it Rosh Hashanah, the first of the year, the New Year. This is their celebration in normally around mid-September. This is Yom Kippur is celebrated on the 10th day of this month. And then the Feast of Tabernacles, the 7-day Feast of Tabernacles, which has got resurrection and new creation language all over it in Leviticus. Okay, so there they are in summary. Here's the part, I want you to see the names here because there's a first fruits during the first trip. There appears to be a first fruits during the second trip. So look at them in bold here. This is on slide 14, Chris. There's 3 trips here. It says 3 times a year you will celebrate a feast to me. You will observe 1, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And then you see a second one in verse 16, the Feast of the Harvest of the First Fruits. So that would be in Deuteronomy 16 what's called the Feast of Weeks. See that over on the right? So the Feast of the Harvest of the First Fruits here is the Feast of Weeks. And you're going, wait a minute. I thought there was a festival of first fruits during the first trip. Yeah, so think about the language of Paul. Christ the first fruits, and after him we have the first fruits of the Spirit. It's all tied up in this, I think. The Feast of the Unleavened Bread here, the Feast of Weeks, the first of first fruits, and then look, it's called the Feast of the Ingathering here in Exodus. In Deuteronomy, it's called the Feast of Booths. And Leviticus, I think it's called the Feast of Tabernacles, I believe, the Sukkot, I believe, in Leviticus. So anyway, those are the big 3 for the big traveling times to Jerusalem. 3 times a year, appearing before the Lord, journeys to Jerusalem. Okay, here's the first one. We'll do these 3 and then we'll be done. So here's the first one. First trip. Ponder the sequence of timing in the first trip. So here's what it says in verse 5 of Leviticus 23. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at twilight is the Lord's Passover. So this harkens all the way back to Exodus chapter 12. God put this in place. It was to be a statute throughout their generations. The Passover. And they took the lamb. Y'all remember the story. The unblemished lamb. On the 15th day, it says here, of the month, is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And that goes on for 7 days. So feast number 1 is Passover. That would be celebrated on the night of Passover. Then the second feast is a feast that goes on for 7 days. This is the unleavened bread. And it says here, on the first day, watch this language. On the first day of what? So on the 14th day is the Lord's Passover. Then on the 15th day, for 7 days, is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. On the first day, which day would that be? It's got to be the 15th day, right? The first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Yeah? I think it's got to be that first day. On the first day, no work, he says. So it's like the Passover is celebrated, and then the next day, special day, Sabbath day. Verse 10, then, you can see in summarizing the rest of this, it says, you shall bring in, so this is the, we're going 1, 2, 3. They're in Jerusalem. So they're doing Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread for a week. And then they're doing the Feast of the First Fruits here. This is the third of the 7. He says, you shall bring in the sheath of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest. And look at this language in verse 11. He shall wave the sheaf before the Lord for you to be accepted on the day after the Sabbath. Now, which day would that be? The day after the Sabbath. Which day of the week would that be? The day after the Sabbath. So you have 6 days, and then the 7th day is a Sabbath. So what's the next day? The first day of the next week. Isn't that interesting? So he seems to have some emphasis here being placed on that next day, on the first day. Now, see what you think. Look right underneath my box here. It says, I have for you what the word for first fruits is here. The word for first fruits there is the Hebrew word. Yeah. It's the Hebrew word reshit. Now, I'm going to show you in just a second. There's a different word used in the next feast for first fruits. But I don't see how you can read the idea of first fruits here and not think about the creation story. This is the first word of the Bible, reshit. So I'm wondering, and Chris, you tell me if you agree. I quoted, look on the right-hand side of this slide over here. Every single one of the gospel authors make it a point to say it was the first day of the week. And I'm wondering if I'm not supposed to read Leviticus and go, the first day, that would be the first day of the new week. It would make me hearken back to the story of creation and go, oh yeah, this is the way life is.
It's a reboot.
It's a reboot. It's the way life, this is the way it's supposed to be. Mm-hmm. It's all right now. Mm-hmm. It's the first day. The beginning has happened.
Mm-hmm. It's all reset because of resurrection.
I think so. It's been reset. The resurrection changed everything.
And we can live in that.
Yes, it's the resetting. Yeah, the first day. Okay, that's the first one. Here's the second one. So, continue on in Leviticus 23. You will count for yourselves from the day after the Sabbath, from the day after you brought in the sheaf of the wave offering. There will be 7 complete Sabbaths. You will count 50 days to the day after the 7th Sabbath. Then the priest shall then wave them, there it is, with the bread of the first fruits for a wave offering. Now, this word for first fruits is not the word used earlier in the chapter. This is the Hebrew word, the root of which is bakur. Bakur. Now, if you search for that word first, if you search for that root for the first fruits, bakur, in the Hebrew Bible, This is the first one that comes up. Abel's offering. It says in my Bible, he brought the firstlings of his flock. Literally, Abel brought, for his sacrifice, he brought the firstborn, the first fruits. That's what he brought for his sacrifice. Which ties together, I think, with this idea of God demanding the firstborn. This ties in with Mary bringing Jesus to the temple. It was her symbolic offering of him, and that's why she made the sacrifices of the doves and the pigeons, according to Leviticus 12. It's the stuff in Numbers, how he says the Levites, it's okay, they're going to be the substitute for the firstborn kind of thing. This is the word for firstborn. Now, if you go to the New Testament and you track the Greek equivalent down of firstborn, oh my word. Look at how Paul describes Jesus in Colossians 1. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn. He is the firstborn from the dead. The author of Hebrews, when he brings the firstborn into the world. Look up at Luke. When she gave birth to her firstborn son, her prototokos, her firstborn, the first fruit, the firstborn. They're tied together, I think. So there's a lot here. I'd like to just sit and just think about it for a long time. The first fruits and the firstborn. These concepts are tied together in the Hebrew Bible, and the New Testament authors are just there. They're just tying all this into the Jesus story. Okay, last one is the third trip. And you can see here in Numbers 29, it says, now in the 7th month, on the first day of the month, you will also have a holy convocation, doing no laborious work. It shall be to you a day for blowing trumpets. The Feast of the Trumpets. And here's the word that's used here for trumpet. Tira'ah. Tira'ah, the Hebrew word. So there's 3 Hebrew words for trumpets, and they all seem to be tied in. I'm going to show you with each of them. They all seem to be tied together with the idea of the coming victorious king. All of them. So this word in Numbers 23 about God coming, bringing the people of Israel out of Egypt, the shout of the king, that word shout there is this same word for trumpets. Here's another word for trumpets. There's this thing in Numbers chapter 10. So the nation has been at Sinai for a long time, and that's like from Exodus 20 all the way to Numbers chapter 10. And you can see down here, they're about to leave. And he has this weird story about blowing trumpets. And the word for trumpet here is Hatzotzra. Hatzotzra. The trumpets. And so look again here at the quote that I have from Psalm 98. The Hatzotzra. The Hatzotzra. These are the trumpets, the sound. Shout joyfully before the king. And the other word for trumpet is also used here. The shofar. So the Hatzotzra, the Tira'ah, and the shofar, all these are words for the shout of the coming king. It's used as, like in Joshua, the war cry, the shout before the walls fall in Jericho is this word. And then the trumpet, the blowing of the trumpets, the shofars. Look at how it's tied together here in my red underline. It says there, also in the day of your gladness and in your appointed feast, on the first days of your months, you will blow the trumpets over your burnt offerings. So the last one's called the Feast of Trumpets, but I got an impression here that what's actually going on is they're blowing trumpets every time. The trumpet is the sound of the expected king. The trumpet is the sound. The trumpet heralds the defeat of evil. It heralds the new day. Like right after the trumpets are blown here, they line up and they leave Sinai headed into the land. So the blowing of the trumpets is a big deal. And Paul picks up on it. Paul picks up on the trumpets in 1 Corinthians 15. I was going to show you another trumpet, but anyway, that's good enough for the trumpets. There's another one that tracks shofar down in some of the prophets. So look at slide, we'll finish with this one. Back in 1 Corinthians 15, he says, Now I say this, brethren, that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. Behold, I tell you a mystery. We will not all sleep, but we will all be changed. You see that? Paul does not expect that it's going to be long. Yeah? It's coming quickly. We will not all sleep. We will all be changed. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised. Sorry. This is serious hope that the story of Jesus holds out for those of us who are believers. And it's all over the New Testament. I've got some other quotes here of the trumpets from the New Testament for you to look at. And then Paul finishes the chapter. Paul finishes the chapter with a couple of quotes, one from Isaiah and another one from, where's the other one from? Hosea. But I wanted to read this one to you because he just lifts it straight out of the hope language out of Isaiah 25. So I'm going to read that and then play the song for you. So 1 Corinthians 15:54 says, But when this perishable will have put on the imperishable, and this mortal will have put on immortality, then will come about the saying that is written, Death is swallowed up in victory. Isaiah 25. The Lord of hosts will prepare a lavish banquet for all peoples on this mountain. A banquet of aged wine, choice pieces with marrow, and refined aged wine. And on this mountain, he will swallow up the covering which is over all peoples, even the veil which is stretched over all nations. He will swallow up death for all time. And the Lord God will wipe tears away from all faces. He will remove the reproach of his people from all the earth, for the Lord has spoken. It will be said in that day, Behold, this is our God, for whom we have waited, that he might save us. This is the Lord, for whom we have waited. Let us rejoice and be glad in his salvation.
When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well. My soul, it is well with my soul. It is well, it is well with my soul. My sin, oh the bliss of this glorious thought. My sin, not in part, but the whole, is nailed to a cross, and I bear it no more. Praise the Lord, it is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. And Lord, haste the day when the faith shall be sight, the clouds be rolled back as a scroll, the trump shall resound, and the Lord shall descend. Even so, it is well with my soul. It is well with my soul.